Hello and welcome to wakilsahab.com, and this is Advocate Mehboob, and today is our 12th lecture of this LFJ lecture series, and today we have with us uh, you know Advocate Kushank Sindhu. So he is a partner at Sigma Chambers Advocates and Solicitors. So he is going to speak on a topic which is called as an overview of anti-corruption laws in India. So corruption cases are very popular in India. Always uh, we see in news many, what do you say, politicians, businessmen, and other people are being caught. I'm sure civilians are also caught too, or regular people. And this is a very important topic, and this has this area has a set of laws, and sir has been generous enough to bring it together, bring those what do you say, acts together today, and he's going to speak on that. Let me speak about our honorable speaker. And the first thing is that he has a lot of corporate experience. He has worked at ICICI Bank, and he has worked in a lot contract drafting, transaction structuring, and litigation. So he has advised on transactions in relation to RFPs and bidding documents and bank guarantees. And 1 second. He has worked in contracts and documentation for leading car manufacturing company. He has handled employment related queries for global information technology companies, consulting companies, which are outsourcing companies, and internet intermediaries. So he has leveraged exposure to US laws and US attorneys in providing assistance to Indian clients. And he has worked in Ruby term loan agreements, working capital facility agreements, and he has advised on securitization of loan books of a bank. So there are a lot of detailed experiences. But if I look at broader perspective, he has had litigation and what do you say, dispute resolution career. He has been involved in arbitration. He has been involved in civil suits. He has worked in company and insolvency laws. He has worked on consumer protection laws. He has worked on criminal laws. He has worked on debt recovery, environmental law, intermediary law, and this he has also, if we go back to his education, he has graduated from Nalsar University in the year 2014. And Nalsar is one of the top law universities in India. And we are very fortunate that a person who has come from an eminent university, as he is an alumni of such eminent university one, and he has so versatile experience on so many different specializations of law, has generously agreed to speak to us. We are really privileged and thankful to Kushank Sindhu sir for coming today. Sir, thank you so much for coming to speak today.
Thank you, Advocate Mehboob. It is really a pleasure for me to come and address on your platform. I'm very happy that, especially someone from Hyderabad, is conducting this, having stayed most of my life in Hyderabad, in Nalsar, and attending schools in Hyderabad. So that is it feels really nice. And now I'm practicing both at Delhi and Hyderabad because we have offices at both places. So the topic for today's uh, webinar is something which I would say most people are really familiar with, because as when we talk about corruption, it is something that a lot of us have encountered in our day-to-day lives in different ways. And be it the traffic challans and the traffic police, that is the payment that you make, that a lot of people make, etc., that kind of thing. And people usually associate that with corruption. Obviously there are the forms of corruption where you go ahead and you give money as bribe for any kind of permit or any kind of license for starting a company or anything of that sort. So obviously all those are forms of corruption in our day-to-day lives. But the point is that from the legal perspective, corruption is a much wider term. And from the legal perspective, usually people associate corruption cases with what is known as the Prevention of Corruption Act. People associate largely with the anti-corruption bureaus in different states or with the CBI. And obviously, they are the principal organs which deal with corruption related issues all over India. However, the objective of today's webinar is to probably just sort of give all of you, I'm told that the audience includes lawyers and law students, a broad overview of what the laws relating to corruption in India are. It is more of a kite flying tour of the different dimensions of corruption from the legal perspective, in the sense of the different legislations that govern the issues of corruption in India. And each component of it, each subject in itself. And I'm sure after this webinar, if we have subsequent webinars, then we can sort of go deep into each and every legislation. But having said so, again, just to give you a broad overview of corruption related legislations in India, you obviously first have the Prevention of Corruption Act, which is the principal legislation dealing with corruption in India. But there are different dimensions, as I said. So you also have the Benami Transactions Prohibition Act. You also have the Income Tax Act 1961, which deals with some form of corruption. You also have different dimensions of corruption which are being dealt with by different statutory and constitutional bodies. For example, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, the CVC, the Central Vigilance Commission, the CCI, the Competition Commission of India. On a more sort of current basis, while these are obviously the standard legislation that we have, on a more recent level, you would have noticed the issue of lobbying when in the context of the 2G tapes and the Nira Radia scandal, etc. So lobbying is also something that corruption deals with. And then the last dimension is public procurement. So these are all facets of corruption which the law has tried to tackle as and when they develop with time. And to some extent, we have been able to tackle. To some extent, we are yet to go all the way because the bills, etc., that had been introduced in Parliament have lapsed. So in this background, let us start with looking at the IPC, the Indian Penal Code, and the Prevention of Corruption Act. Now, all of you know that the Indian Penal Code essentially was enacted in the year 1860. So it is a very old legislation. And earlier you had sections 161 to 165A of the Indian Penal Code, which dealt with different dimensions of corruption. For example, illegal gratification to public servants, for example, bribery, or influencing public servants through corruption and other illegal means. So these were the 4-5 offenses which the Indian Penal Code originally had. There was some amendments which were introduced through the Criminal Law Amendment Ordinance, if I remember correctly, of 1944, which also dealt with some dimensions of corruption, but again, it was just an ordinance which came and went. You then had the Prevention of Corruption Act 1947, which really was sort of an all-encompassing legislation dealing with, again, different dimensions of corruption. But what actually is now relevant is the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988. And the era between 1988 and 2018 was an important era because in these 30 years, you had this legislation operating, and you had the, I would say, the foundations of anti-corruption laws in India being established. You also had an agency, a specialized agency, which is known as the CBI. It is essentially the Delhi Special Police Establishment, which was introduced through a resolution. So that deals majorly with corruption in India. You also have, as I said, the CVC, CAG, etc. But now when you look at the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988, that is very important because what it essentially did was to consolidate all laws in relation to corruption in India. So that really became the Bible of what is known as the anti-corruption law in India. Earlier, now what is very important for us to understand is that the amendment which was introduced in 2018, that was really a watershed year when it comes to anti-corruption laws in India. Also, the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1988 really amended a lot of things which were not there in the earlier legislations. But there are two issues when it comes to corruption that people usually do not have as much, and because we do these cases on an almost a daily basis. But these are the problems that we are encountering on a practical level. And that is that you obviously know that the bribe taker is guilty, that the person who's taking the bribe is guilty. But what is often ignored, especially with people who do not come from a background which deals with these issues more regularly, is that even the bribe giver can be held guilty in certain cases. Now that is very important, that came through the amendment. Now there is another way of looking at it, because there is an escape clause which is there and immunity which is being granted to the bribe giver. Because there are obviously certain cases in which one is compelled to give bribe, even though you don't want to, but given the urgency, given the circumstances, there might be situations where you have to give bribe. But in those situations, the law provides for an immunity if you report the bribe giving within 7 days of the giving of the bribe to any public servant. That is very important, because practically people are getting confused that bribe givers are not liable even after so many years of the provision being introduced. Also, again, when you talk about the practical implementation of this legislation, bribe givers are practically also were being largely investigated against by the investigating authorities, when they were also co-conspirators, etc., and they were also a co-accused in a larger conspiracy where the corruption scandal was happening. But the point is that when you talk about the black letter of the law, it does not matter whether or not you're part of a larger conspiracy. The mere fact that you have given bribe is itself a punishable offense. The other aspect of anti-corruption in India is when you deal with the corruption between private entities. So one of the basic level of corruption obviously is that if a private person is giving bribe to a government or a public official, which is what the term is, who is performing a public duty. But what about two cases? One is that if you are giving bribe to a private individual, will that also be covered under the gamut of corruption? Is something which continues to remain in many respects a slight gray area, and I'll tell you why. What the law says is that it uses a term what is known as a public duty. So if someone is performing a public duty, even though the person is not strictly a public servant, in the sense that he or she is not a gazetted officer or a non-gazetted officer or someone who is drawing a regular salary from the government, then in those cases will the Prevention of Corruption Act be applicable? There is one case of the Supreme Court, which was a Central Bank of India versus Ramesh Gheli. Now, in that case, even in the context of a private bank, the court observed that because a public duty was being performed, but because it was a private bank, even then the person would be held liable under the Prevention of Corruption Act for giving or receiving bribe. So this aspect is very important. There was another case, if you all are interested, and you all should go through, because these are all interesting cases, because because the implication of these cases is not restricted only to corruption related offenses, because also when you are establishing the nexus between a public servant and between any officer and the notion of what constitutes a public servant, it is not just corruption related issues which are attracted, but also certain concomitant duties and rights which flow from the Constitution of India can also be made applicable in these situations. Now, in Bhupinder Singh Sikka versus CBI, what happened was that there was an insurance company which had been created by an act of parliament. Now, when the insurance company had been created, because it had been created by an act of parliament, then the court held that the employee would fall within the definition of a public servant, and hence all these legislation would be applicable. Now, to understand, again, I would say in my view that if you have to understand whether or not your the provisions of the Prevention of Corruption Act should be made applicable, whether or not the person should be held to be a public servant, you should also go through Article 12 of the Constitution of India, because Article 12 of the Constitution of India actually defines what the state is. And then there is a whole line of cases which talk about what is a state. Is a mere company, is state the original state, which is obviously the Union of India or the state governments, or what are the bodies if they have been established under an act of parliament, or even if they have not been established under an act of parliament, if it is a private company where the government is a majority shareholder, can that be a state? Now, why is all this discussion important? That this discussion is important in my view, because then the logical conclusion is that, okay, if there is one organization which is the state, then logically the Prevention of Corruption Act should be made liable, because anybody working over there is performing a public duty. So that is one view of looking at it. But the point is that when you talk about corruption between private entities, that sort of remains a gray area. That is not something which has been really sort of clarified by the law. And again, it has to be dealt with on a case-to-case basis. The other aspect is that when you talk about foreign officials who are being bribed, whether or not the Prevention of Corruption Act should be held liable, or whether or not the other anti-corruption laws be applicable, is not something that is very clear. And as I said, when it comes to bribe givers, it is usually in the context of your co-accused or co-conspirators that they are prosecuted. Now, there are certain other amendments which have been introduced in the Prevention of Corruption Act, which I would say any practitioner should be aware of, and obviously anybody who's doing it on a regular basis would clearly know. And that is the concept of a day-to-day trial. Because when you talk about the CBI or any of these anti-corruption agencies, you have cases which are going on forever, for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. The legislation clearly says that you have to endeavor to have day-to-day trials, and endeavor to complete it within a span of 2 years. But again, what happens is that, practically speaking, in courts, what we are observing is that people are taking adjournment on different issues, because of different reasons. For example, if you talk about witnesses not appearing, especially in the cases of larger scams which are there, for example, the coal scam which is going on, there are so many. Practically it becomes difficult because there are so many accused. It is a very technical scam. There are too many accused involved in the so-called scam. Then the logical consequence is that you will have to have special courts to adequately enforce this day-to-day trial business, which is why in Delhi, for example, there are certain designated only coal scam cases, courts, where the CBI is only prosecuting the coal scam matters. The other aspect which is very important is the aspect of sanction under the PC Act. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this specific aspect, because this is something which is something that I would say requires a webinar in itself, but I'm going to just say 3 things. What the PC Act talks about is there is something called a sanction for prosecution. Now, sanction for prosecution flows from Section 13(1) Clause D of the PC Act. Now, this 13(1) has to be read with the provisions of the CRPC, or Section 197 of the CRPC. Basically, the idea behind the sanction for prosecution is that because, and this is the parliamentary logic behind it, that because you have public servants who are performing a public duty and who are sort of engaging constantly with the public, that it is very important for them to be protected from frivolous complaints and from frivolous litigation. And this is also important because what we are seeing is that there are a lot of genuine, honest officers who have been prosecuted under both the other laws and especially under the PC Act, only because they have been performing something which requires exercise of some discretion. Now, when you talk about the exercise of some discretion, there is a public official who might want to allow a building to be constructed in some place. Now, there might be 10 people who are affected by the building which has been constructed. There might be 50 people who are affected by a factory which has been allowed in some place for whatever reason, right or wrong. But merely because some person has been affected by it does not necessarily mean that there is corruption. And it is because of this reason that you have the protection of sanction for prosecution, which has been introduced in both the PC Act and the regular CRPC. Now, this is again important because then the issue is that who gives the sanction for prosecution when you talk about the PC Act. Now, when you talk about bank officials, for example, it is usually the bank, it is usually the parent agency which has employed the bank official, which will allow, which will give the sanction for the prosecution. Usually in the case of parliamentarians, if I remember correctly, I think it is the speaker who gives the sanction for prosecution. Now, sanction for prosecution is a very common concept even under the IPC, because for certain offenses you need, even if the person is not a public servant, you still need a sanction from some senior government official, again to avoid misuse. For example, in a 498A case, which is cruelty against the wife, and in that entire gamut of dowry, 498A, you know, that entire set of sections, it is not something that that anybody can just you file and then the arrest automatically happens. Even for arrest, you need the permission of, practically at least in some states, this is what I've seen, that you need the permission of the local SP or the DCP if it is a city. So that is one. What constitutes public official is something which, as I said, is very unclear. It really depends on what is the role, what is the, you know, what is the role the person is performing on a day-to-day basis, especially qua his professional profile. Now, one thing which is very important for us to understand, and this is especially important for companies, because what happens is that basically I would just limit it to this, that sometimes companies need to be aware of the fact that even if you are working under a company, you can still be held liable for any kind of corruption activities. Now, if you look at Section 9 of the Prevention of Corruption Act, it talks about prosecution of commercial organizations. Now, this is very important because if it says that if there is any person associated with a commercial organization who gives up or makes a promise to give any undue advantage to a public servant. So this is very important. So if there is, say, a commercial, or if there is a company which wants to set up a factory, and for getting the license or the permit of that factory, there is some kind of an undue advantage being given to a public servant. Always remember that just because you are a company which is giving some sort of an undue advantage to a public servant, you may not be protected, because the company may be fined, and the company is a separate juristic entity. The company can be held liable, the company can be fined. But even anybody who is, and the words say any person associated, which is in itself a very wide term. So you can have regular employees, and theoretically, again, depends on a case to case basis, you can also have people who are not your regular employees, but who have acted on behalf of a company to give such undue advantage to a public servant. If that happens, under this section, again going strictly as per this section, you can still be held liable. So what this talks about is basically your where there is consent, even if you have not really you have not really gone and given the bribe, but if you have consented to it or you have connived with the person, then you can be held liable. Now, why is all this discussion important? In foreign, in the US entities, basically in the West, what is happening is that there are very strict anti-money laundering. There are very strict laws which govern, internal corporate governance within the companies, and this is very important because even us, when we have to sort of work for companies and etc., then even lawyers have to give an undertaking that they will not do which is in violation of the anti-corruption laws of their countries. So there is one act in the US especially, which is known as the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So you have to be strictly in compliant with it. So I'm just saying that it is on these lines that the act, the Prevention of Corruption Act, the Companies Act, all these talk about protecting the company in certain ways. Now, how do you protect your company is again something which a lot of companies are grappling with, and they come to us for. What I have seen in many cases is that you need to have very strict internal policies in place and internal procedures in place where you clearly in writing convey to your employees, convey to everybody who is associated, convey to everybody who's associated with your company to ensure that they are not indulging in any kind of corrupt practices or anything of that sort. That is extremely important. Now, practically, again, what is happening is people are, they do not invest as much in these things. But the point is that this is not something that from the company perspective can give you return immediately. But if there is a prosecution happening on anti-corrupt, on the allegations of corruption, then you have some grounds to say that you have, as a company and as directors of the company, you have discharged your responsibility by conveying and telling everybody that you should not follow certain, you should not indulge in any kind of corrupt practices. That is very important, and the law provides for a protection to the company and its management if adequate procedures and protection is taken to avoid such a situation where employees are bribing, saying that they are on behalf of the company. Now, the other aspect is that when you talk about companies, especially, and this is important because mostly there are companies, be it the 2G scam or whatever, there are usually companies, people acting under the umbrella of a company who are being investigated against. Practically what is happening is that even directors are made accused mostly in complaints when it comes to anti-corruption. So, and this becomes a task because the directors are, at the end of the day, they are the directors of the company, they are running the company. But what you should also see is that in fact there are judgments to this effect, that just because you are a director does not mean that you should be made liable for anything and everything that has gone wrong in the company. And you have to have specific allegations as to what was the specific role of the director in that particular offense. So just because there was some corrupt, some activity which had happened in some corner of some country of the same company, that does not make all the directors necessarily liable. You have to show some kind of nexus between that act and the director. So this is very important. If that is not there, then you can always, then there are ways of getting out of it. You can call for a discharge, and you can be discharged from the case, or you can go in for a quashing or under the CRPC or whatever. But this part is extremely important, that don't think that just because you are a director, you are automatically liable for everything that goes wrong. You are not. If you did not know, you did not know, period. This is not to say that you will still have fiduciary duties, etc., that you will have to fulfill over director. Now that is a different discussion altogether. But my point is that merely because you are a director does not necessarily mean you're liable for everything that goes wrong. I've already covered the aspect of sanction. Sanction is very important in these cases. A lot of cases in the PC Act, are delayed, and also they are, from the accused, because we appear also majorly on the defense side. A lot of cases are won only because there was no proper sanction which was received for the prosecution. That is very important because there has to be valid sanction before there is any prosecution under the PC Act. Now, if there is no valid sanction, does it render the entire trial, the entire investigation invalid? Is again something which is a gray area, because ideally sanction should be taken prior. If in an instance the sanction is not appropriate, the wrong person has given the sanction for the prosecution, then what happens is again something that really depends on a case-to-case basis. The other aspect is the concept of attachment. Now, earlier it was not there in the act, but now after the amendment, etc., which was introduced, the provisions of attachment of property, etc., have been introduced. Now, there is just one more thing that I would like to sort of highlight, that when you talk about what is known as your PC Act, which is the CBI, there are three bodies of the government which work really in not in tandem, I would say, but in the sense that they would be attracted when there is any major scam happening, and that is the CBI, the ED, and then you have the income tax. Now, the CBI deals with the Prevention of Corruption Act, as I said. Then you have the ED, which will deal with the PMLA offenses, etc. And then you will have the income tax uh, department, which will be dealing with offenses under the Income Tax Act. Now, uh, so this is what again practically happens in a corruption trial. The other, there are several cases. In fact, there is one P. Satyanarayan Murthy versus District Inspector of Police, which, if I remember correctly, is from Andhra itself. That merely because in a situation, merely because there is some money which is in the possession of somebody, does not necessarily mean that the person has actually asked for it and has actually taken it. So, for example, if you are in a police station, or let's not refer to the police all the time, but any department, and there is a trap case which is going on, where somebody has been trapped with receiving some money, and that money is with that person or on the table, it may not necessarily mean that the person has demanded it or the person has accepted it. So this is very important, because merely because in otherwise what will happen is that you will have a lot of people who are just giving money and sending money to different people and then showing that there is corruption, but that is frankly illogical, which is why in certain situations you can always argue that even though the money has come, fine, but that does not mean that I as an accused have actually demanded it. So demand becomes very important. As far as the investigation is concerned, it usually follows the principles of the CRPC, the Code of Criminal Procedure. There are no actually provisions which deal with settlement, etc. In certain cases, they have been allowed. But what usually happens is that at the time of sentencing, the courts usually take a view as to what has to be done, depending upon what the facts of the situation are. So that is as regards your compounding, etc. are concerned. There are other legislations also, which, as I said, are important. Again, the purpose of today's exercise is just to sort of give you an overview of what the different legislations are. So there is also something known as the FCRA, the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act. There are certain entities, there are certain individuals who cannot receive foreign contribution directly, and if they do receive, they have to declare that they have received, or they have to take prior permission, or there are obviously FCRA licenses which are given to NGOs, etc., to receive foreign contributions. Now, there is a restriction on government servants, employees of government, judges, and all these individuals against receiving foreign contributions from foreign bodies. Now, as far as civil servants and government servants, etc., are concerned, civil servants are usually governed. I'm talking about the All India services, and the definition of All India services you should look at under the Constitution. But apart from the IAS, the IPS, there is also the Forest Service, which was introduced as a All India service. So even that is attracted. Now, civil servants are sort of governed, as I said, by the All India Services Act of 1951. Now, civil servants are also covered by the All India Services Conduct Rules of 1968. Now, this is again extremely important, because there is a restriction on what civil servants can do. There is a restriction on what the kind of employment that they can enter into. For example, there is some sort of a restriction on civil servants working for or in NGOs or running NGOs without intimation to the government. There is a lot of restriction on gifts being given to civil servants or civil servants receiving hospitality, except when it comes to casual meal, casual lift, or other social hospitality. Again, why is this practically important? See, this is not just important from the perspective of the civil servants, because obviously a civil servant has to be careful about all this. But you, if you are a private individual, even then you have to be very careful about the extent of help and cooperation you are providing to a civil servant, because the moment it crosses the line which is given in the All India Services Conduct Rules, then also you can come under scrutiny. So this is very important. Before the next time you give any kind of a casual, every time you give some sort of a help to a civil servant, it does not necessarily mean that there is corruption. But even if you're giving some sort of a casual help, it is still fine, but within the boundaries of law which have been prescribed. Then you have other civil central services rules, etc., which govern depending upon the nature of the employment of the government officer. As I was referring to earlier, when you had the Neera Radia scandal and the Radia tapes, etc., in that background there was a concept of lobbying, which is there. Now, the concept of lobbying is very interesting. Now, what is lobbying? Lobbying, usually people mean that, there are people who have suitcases of cash and who are doing the rounds of government offices, etc., trying to lobby for something. Lobbying is not necessarily that. There can be legitimate ways of lobbying also. In fact, if I remember correctly, because there was something that we were dealing with, I think with an Indian client having some work in the US. Can you believe it that in the US, lobbying expenses to some extent are also, if I remember correctly, tax deductible. There is a tax deduction which is given on lobbying. That is there. Now, to have such a sophisticated system of lobbying for proper disclosure, the government had earlier introduced a lobbying bill, which, if I remember correctly, was in 2013. But now the bill has lapsed. But again, this is one area which people should explore, and especially law students should discuss and research into what kind of lobbying uh, legislation we can have. Now, apart from these, there is also the Central Vigilance Commission, which is there. You also have the Comptroller and Auditor General, who's there, and both these sort of bodies you keep hearing whenever there is some kind of a corruption news which comes out in on any of the news channels or in any of the newspapers. Now, what are these very mysterious CVC and CAG, or rather high profile CVC and CAG? Now, CVC is the Central Vigilance Commission, which was, if I remember correctly, set up in the year 1964 under the recommendations of the Santanam Committee. Now, basically, the Central Vigilance Commission exercises some sort of a control over the Delhi Special Police Establishment, which is also known as the CBI, when it comes to investigation of prevention of corruption cases. That is broadly what the role of the CVC is. It is composed by of a group of retired, usually civil servants who have some expertise in law, banking, etc. Now, this is very important because the inter-se relationship between the CVC and the CBI really comes out when it talks about when you talk about corruption cases. Now, interestingly, the role of the CBI has also gone beyond just corruption cases, but usually the CVC deals with that aspect of the CBI which is into investigation of corruption cases. Apart from that, you have the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. Now, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India is a constitutional authority which is there. What does the Comptroller and Auditor General do? It is that constitutional authority which deals with, as the name suggests, audit. Audit meaning that everything, all accounts, etc., of any organization are are in order. They have complied with the law. There is no money which has gone here or there. That is what largely in common parlance what audit is. Usually audit can be an internal audit or an audit can be an external audit. Now, the CAG, I would say, is something of an external auditor, meaning it is outside the government. The central government also has their internal auditors. That is also there. The audit committee is there. There is an entire there is an entire service which is known as the Indian Civil Account Service, the ICAS. And that basically deals with internal audit. Apart from maintaining accounts, it is about internal audit. The CAG is an independent authority. It is outside the government and it does external auditing from outside the government. What happens is that because of its independent nature and constitutional nature, the courts also in different cases ask and order the CAG to conduct some sort of an audit of some institution, of some project. But the courts have all, where they smell that there is something fishy going on. But interestingly, it is not just government offices, not just government organizations where the courts have ordered. Even sometimes in public, especially in public-private partnerships, the courts have ordered CAG audit. In fact, interestingly, I remember in 2016, if I remember correctly, I was in the Supreme Court, and there is something called the Delhi Noida Direct Flyway, the DND, which used to have a a toll a toll barrier basically. So between Delhi and Noida, Noida is in the NCR region. Now, whenever you used to go, you as with any other toll, you pay. There was a different company which had been set up for this purpose. The question was that whether or not the company should still operate the toll plaza or it should go to the Noida authority or who should be handling it. And then there was an argument that the DND, that company, had been set up only till the point that the cost of the road, because they had constructed that flyway, was met and some targets were met. The court, even in that case, ordered the CAG audit because just to ascertain whether or not the targets, etc., or whatever the contract provides for, have been met by that company. So, point being that CAG is something which has been used by the government, by the Supreme Court and the High Courts also, in different cases to conduct audits and investigation. The other way in which the CAG reports are used is when the CAG report forms the basis of some investigation which is ordered either by the government or by the Supreme Court. For example, if you look at if the Center for Environment and Food Security versus Union of India, where the implementation of NREGA was ascertained, and then you had another case, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I'm just reading it out. It is a Center for PIL, Public Interest Litigation versus Union of India. So practically, the CAG reports have formed the basis of a lot of PILs in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has also ordered investigation. Now, apart from this, and you should go through the study which has been done by another this law firm called Nishit Desai. So they have really gone into uh, the other dimensions of corruption. Now, these are all very standard authorities and standard laws which deal with corruption in India. But there are also specialized legislations which deal with corruption, and companies, etc., have to be specially aware of that. For example, if you look at the Competition Act, where the CCI, the Competition Commission of India, has ordered investigation if in certain cases acting on certain information which has been received. So, for example, there was certain. What does the CCI basically do? When you talk about monopoly in very simple words is like two shopkeepers are selling something which is very special, and they are selling it in one place where there is no other competition, and there are just one or two shopkeepers who are doing it. So they come together and then they impose a price on the commodity which is extremely high. So to avoid those kind of very practices, the Competition Commission of India has been established. In certain cases, the CCI has taken cognizance of CAG reports on procurement, etc., and then ordered investigation into cartelization and monopoly to investigate into anti-corruption, just to investigate from the lens of anti-corruption. Apart from that, the Companies Act also provides for certain provisions of dealing with corruption when it comes to companies. For example, Section 177 of the Companies Act provides for the establishment of a vigil mechanism for directors and employees to report genuine concerns within the companies. So that is also there. The Income Tax Act provides for illegal gratification, that is something, there can be no, it is something which is disallowed, and there can be no deduction which can be asked for if you have made any illegal gratification. Now, as I've also said that there was the, the lobbying bill. Apart from that, there was also the Whistleblowers Protection Act, and then you had the procurement bill which was introduced. Now, there is one office which I would like to dedicate like 5-7 minutes to before I conclude, and that is what is known as the SFIO. The SFIO is in the nature of what is known is basically the Serious Frauds Investigation Office. There are certain other countries also which have the same body, the Serious Fraud Investigation Office, which deal with. Now, what does the SFIO deal with? For that, you will have to look at section 211 and 212 of the Companies Act 2013. Now, the section basically says that the central government can authorize the SFIO to deal with certain offences which have been mentioned. For example, those which relate to the Companies Act, or certain frauds which are, or certain offences in the larger public interest. This is what the role of the SFIO is. Now, the SFIO had also come to a lot of public limelight when the Satyam scam was going on. Because when the Satyam scam was going on, then there was an entire panel of bodies which had come, which was again some sort of corruption, you might just say, because you had the Andhra CID which was there, then you had the SFIO which was there, and then you had the SEBI also, if I remember correctly. They were, because it was a multidisciplinary investigating agencies handling different aspects of the scam. Now, the SFIO, what it does is that, for example, I'll just give you a case which I was handling recently. That was in the context of a minority shareholder. Now, when you talk about a minority shareholder in companies, what happens is that people are, the minority shareholders, they can be removed by the company by some or the other means where the majority shareholders act against the minority shareholder, if they feel that the minority shareholder is not supporting the majority. Now, against, if there is a valid ground, if there is no valid ground for termination or removal, or they have just been removed through some scam which was going on, then a minority shareholder usually files what is known as an O&M, an operation and mismanagement petition, that is filed in the company law tribunal. The appeals from the NCLT go to the NCLAT. Now, there was a case in which the NCLAT had restored, NCLAT or NCLT had restored the directorship of the minority shareholders. Now the question was of the minority shareholder. Now the question was that after the minority shareholders directorship has been restored, can that individual go to the SFIO, the Serious Frauds Investigation Office, and report that there have been certain crimes or offences which have been committed and ask for an investigation? Now, this is where the role of the SFIO becomes slightly interesting, where I would say that there is a gray area. The SFIO is not normally like a normal police station where you just go and file a complaint. It is under section 211 or 212 of the Companies Act. It is a central government which orders and instructs the SFIO to investigate into to any fraud or fraud, etc., which has been committed within a company or outside. So what do you do? How do you approach the SFIO is a question. Now, there are different theories of going about it. Really depends from case to case, depending upon what the case is about. One way is that you obviously just go to the central government and make a representation that there is some corruption which has been going on, some activity which has been going on within the some company, and then the central government should order the SFIO to investigate. Or you can directly go to the SFIO, but then there is another school of thought which says that the SFIO does not have suo motu cognizance because it is not like any other company. So again, this is something that needs to be seen on a case-to-case basis. So this is with which I would sort of end this webinar to the extent of telling you to the extent of giving you an overview of anti-corruption laws in India. The aim, and just to sort of summarize, the idea behind this webinar was to tell you that the notion of corruption is a very wide term. And it arises especially in the context of commercial transactions, because there are a lot of layers of corruption and a lot of complexities of corruption involved. It is when you, and as not just as lawyers and as law people, as practitioners or students, but also as private citizens and as companies, you have to look at not just the Prevention of Corruption Act, but also acts like the Benami Transaction Prohibition Act, the Income Tax Act, the Competition Commission of India Act, and understand the role of different institutions like the CBI, the state anti-corruption bureaus, the CVC, the CAG, etc., while understanding what corruption is about and how it should be dealt with. The next time, if there is a company, then always make anti-corruption policies a part of your company to ensure that if anything goes wrong and if you are as a company investigated against, then you have your internal documentation to show that you had taken adequate care and precaution that no employee indulges in corruption. For lawyers especially, it is important to understand the defenses that can be taken, the immunity that can be taken when it comes to a corruption investigation or corruption prosecution which is going on. You can take a defense if you have not demanded, uh, you have not demanded that the money was just in your possession. You can take a defense if you are the bribe giver, but you have reported within the due, the statutory period of time which has been given. You can take a defense if you have not touched the money or anything, but again, if you have demanded, then that defense might go. A very important defense is the defense of the absence of sanction. A sanction requirement is extremely important both under the CRPC as well as under the Prevention of Corruption Act when you talk about corruption. And so that is something that you really should look at. Now, having said so, having completed this webinar, I would be open to questions if there are any. And if you would like to engage with me on a more detailed basis, you can just take my email from Advocate Mehboob, and I'm available on phone as well as on email. Feel free to contact. Over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was really fantastic. The way you were putting things in a very simplistic way, and I felt like I am in a very good academic lecture. I've gone back to college. That was how I was feeling. So I definitely feel people should get more what do you say, practical lawyers as teachers, and I think this is what we get. Um I'm requesting the audience, if you have any questions of yours, please put it in the chat box. We will definitely try to answer, and I will exercise my moderator's privilege and ask sir the first question. Sir, corruption is undoubtedly, as you have cumulatively brought the broader aspects of corruption law in India, and these are very pertinent points which you have raised about the definition of state, companies and employees, and the giver of corruption, the taker of the corruption. These are like amazing, pertinent, just starting points for us. There's a lot of things to come. But as just like a layman, I would say, like let's say a person is found with 10 crore rupees. Okay, he is having 10 crore rupees in his house. So would it by default assume that he has brought the money from some some corrupt practices? Like it's always there. You have these ED rates. These kind of rates. They go there and they get some huge loads of cash. They say this much cash was collected, and it is assumed to be some corrupt practice. But we as civilians, or even law students, don't understand this. Kindly uh, answer, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I'm very glad that you have asked me this question, because again, this was something that frankly I had kept for my Prevention of Corruption Act webinar, but I'll just cover it over here. So whenever there is a corruption, again in practice, whenever there is a corruption case which is filed, then there are two cases which essentially go side by side, especially under the PC Act. So there is one case which is about the giving and receiving of bribe. The other case is what is known as a DA case. It is a disproportionate assets case. Okay. Now, the example that you have given when it comes to that 10 crore rupees, you will have to see in whose house it was found. Say, for example, and there can be different situations. I'll cover all of them. Now, say for example, it was found in the house of a public servant. Then the question will naturally be that where did you get the 10 crore rupees from? Now, as a public servant, you have to disclose beyond a certain point. If you have received cash, I think it's the limit actually is 5,000 or 10,000 rupees when it comes to at least all India services. That has to be done. Now, if you do not disclose, then it is problematic. Then you have to show it from where did the 10 crore rupees, where did they come from? When the investigation happens, what the investigating authorities will go into is they will look at your annual income. They will look at your annual income from all sources. One is your salary, but then there are also public servants who do not just have a salary, but they say, for example, they have a house, and and then from their house they are getting rental income. So the entire annual income will be seen, and then you will have to show that that 10 crore was something that you were able to get from these five sources which you have already declared to the government. If you have been able to disclose, if you have been able to connect the source with the money, I think there is a margin of 10% which is given. If you have been able to connect it sufficiently, then if you are a public servant, then you are safe. That is one. The other aspect, again, practically what happens is that then they will say that, okay, what is the tax, if you have paid any tax, or etc., if there is any documentation. Because if there is 10 crore in a public servant's house, it would normally mean that there's something wrong. But now the question is, when it comes to a businessman, if say for example the ED raids, or whichever of these authorities, they raid a businessman and then they find 10 crore rupees in cash, even then the point is the same, that whether or not you are able to connect it to something very reasonable or something logical. That is very important. So next time you have like 10 crore rupees in cash in your hands, please ensure that you have adequate documentation to show where did the cash actually come from. Though it is something that is possible, if you have documentation to prove what are the sources, and not just the source, but also where the money will actually be used for, then you are safe. If you are a company and if you can say that, okay, I withdrew the 10 crore from my bank 2 days back, and I am, say for example, I am a builder and I have to pay out my construction workers. Not everybody unfortunately has a bank account. So practically you have to give out in cash. There are days where you have to give out in cash. For that you need liquid cash. So these are all defenses, again depend on a case to case basis which you can take. But again, as if source is confirmed, if you have, say for example, a bank receipt which shows the 10 crore that you have withdrawn, then you are fine.
Thank you so much, sir. Let me go to the audience. We have a lot of people. Yes, is anyone wanting to ask question? Okay, Mr. Ibad is asking, are the current legislations strict enough, or does India have a need for stricter provisions?
See, as I said in my webinar also, there are a few bills which have to be introduced, which are pending. There are certain aspects which are, there are certain gray areas in law which remain. You will have soon the Whistleblowers Act, which has to be, the Whistleblowers Act is there. And then for lobbying, especially, the bill has lapsed. The lobbying bill has to be introduced just to streamline it a bit. As far as strengthening is concerned, you can have all kinds of situations where you have genuine cases also, where you have fake cases also, so that there can be no end to making things strict. But understand one thing, that there are two dimensions to it. One is that when you talk about corruption laws in India, one way of looking at it is that you have to reduce corruption, because because that affects your ease of doing business, etc. Because the more corruption you have, then there is a lot of uncertainty in the economy. No company would want to come because they don't know how much they have to pay. But also it can't be so strict that you actually end up suffocating the businessman. And that is very important, because otherwise everybody will feel scared that, Array, if I should do this or if I should do that, and if whether or not, and this is what is practically in many people say happening, that the moment you take a decision, even if there is no requirement of a need to prove bribe taking or giving, even if it's something which has caused some sort of advantage to somebody, even that can, in some interpretations, come within the definition of anti-corruption, and that becomes problematic, especially for ease of doing business.
Okay, sir. I'll move to the next question. Mr. Srinivas Murthy is asking, sir, does this mean a private organization employee cannot be prosecuted for corruption if taken and proved?
Theoretically, as per the law, the private employee can be prosecuted for corruption if the private employee is giving or giving bribe. That employee can be taken. Apart from the employee, also the company, the directors, whoever is associated with the act of corruption can be prosecuted against. You will have to look at section 9, which is basically the main section of the PC Act.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Miss Nigda is asking, does higher wages offered to the bureaucrats help in reduction of the corruption?
See, I would really just want to, and as a lawyer, because I'm not a psychologist, I would want to stick to what the law says and what you can do to make it more stringent or come out of it. I honestly don't know if, you know, because, you know, it is an entire different field of study, that what causes corruption. That is something that I would say somebody who has done some research on the mindset of the people who have been genuinely convicted, they can answer it better.
Okay. Aham Saha is asking, sir, does a nexus need to be proved between having the cash and yet not biased to be biased in your job? So suppose a person has the extra cash which he is not able to justify, but he is carrying out of his duty rightfully. There's some grammatical issue, but
No, but you know, you don't have to necessarily prove this nexus, the mere possession of cash with something which has gone wrong. What a cash indicates is, you know, it is something which is that there is something wrong. What is wrong is something which is part of investigation. Now, again, as I said, there are two aspects which usually work together. When you are a public servant, you can't justify where the cash has come from. It means that your asset is disproportionate to your known sources of income. This is what a DA case is about, a disproportionate assets case is about. Theoretically, there can be a case that you may have the most honest officer on earth who is doing all his job very diligently. Okay, so there is no corruption in that sense of the term. But the same officer has assets which are disproportionate to his known sources of income. Now that is something which is part of a different case, which is also corruption. So again, theoretically, this nexus need not be proved. But I don't know, I'm yet to frankly find a case in which, you know, a disproportionate asset or a disproportionate case is not linked to not doing a job properly.
okay. Let's move to the next question. Subit Sahu is asking, if corruption is being noticed by me, then where and to whom will I report about it?
If a corruption is being noticed by you, then there is a lot of then different states have different helplines which the states have set up, which you can report. If there is something which is happening at the lowest end of the government or any organization, you can report to the higher authorities. If you can't, then you can report to the government. They have anti-corruption helplines. The ACBs of every state, anti-corruption bureaus of every state have helplines. The Central Bureau of Investigation has helplines. The CVC has helplines. So these are all ways in which you can, report corruption. If none of them work, you can feel free to come to me. I'll help you.
I hope there are pro bono cases being taken by our honorable speaker.
Yes, absolutely. I'll circulate my list of pro bono cases which I have handled. Right. They are, lot of pro bono cases.
Amazing, amazing. Ms. Hajra Kulsum is asking, which law governs the framing of T&Cs in general of a company and also the anti-corruption laws of a company?
The anti-corruption, the TNCs in general of a company, you will have to look at the whole gamut of legislations. Frankly, the Companies Act, obviously, to start with, and then it really depends on the nature of business that you are in. Because if you are, say, for example, running a diagnostic center, that would be different from running a Domino's Pizza franchisee. But when you talk about anti-corruption, then you will have to look at the entire set of Benami Transaction Prohibitions Act, Income Tax Act, Competition Commission of India Act, Prevention of Corruption Act, all these acts, but read that with the state legislations, because different states have some different policies and different procedures. So that is very important.
Amazing. Snigdha is saying, am I corrupt if I offer a bribe when it has been demanded by a public officer?
You can either offer or the public officer has demanded. So when the offer has been made, then you are guilty. When it has been demanded and you have paid, subject to the restrictions which are there in Act, then you can be, then you will be corrupt. But you know, the definition of corrupt is not really specified and explained anywhere. So you just be careful about that before proceeding.
Anyone else wants to ask any question on video or audio? Yes, friends, we are almost at the end of the session. Okay, I don't see any question coming up. Thank you so much, sir. It was, I think, a very enlightening lecture so far. There have been a lot of, I think, mainly there were a lot of starting points to open up different acts and read on them. You have brought some case laws from, I believe Supreme Court and, other things. You have brought, different citations, anecdotes. I think this is a very broad subject, as we had discussed earlier with you. You had also suggested to make a series out of it. I think that would be very good, hopefully, in the coming days. And we are really thankful to Honorable Speaker Mr. Kushank Sindhu sir. He has come down and spoken to us today out of his busy schedule. And thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
And I thank all the audience for joining today. And we have our upcoming talks on today is what, 7th, right? On 9th, we have Mr. L. Ravichandra, designated senior advocate, is going to speak on public interest litigation. And on 10th, we have Mr. Tariq Sayyed from Bombay High Court. He is going to speak on drugs. Sushant Singh case is very popular. I think we can get some information on drugs related cases, NDPS Act. And on 11th, we have Mr. Sadiq Hussain. He's going to speak on RTI Act. He's an advocate and RTI activist. On 13th, we are having a law relating to political parties and elections, which is going to be given by Professor Afroz Alam. He is the head of Department of Political Science at Manu University, Hyderabad. Please try to follow our updates through various groups. I'm just sharing the link here for our YouTube channel. My request is, if you can click and you can subscribe, that will be very helpful. And also we have a feedback form. So just a moment, I'll give the, link for that. So we have started this feedback form. Please give your feedback for today's session. Okay, you can find it in the chat box. You can find these two messages from me. And thank you. I'll just, you have these two links here, friends. You can click this and you can check out more information. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Have a good night. Thank you so much.